Anyway. Good. One and two. Good. Well, I shall set off. Today I am talking about something which in theory I know something about, unusually, called Russia, which probably means that it'll be the worst lecture you'll ever hear, but let's hope not. Good. All right. Where to start? Well, perhaps to start at the beginning. You know, as empires go, the Russian Empire was a great success, by which I mean the old Russian Empire. What had started in the early 14th century as this tiny principality on the furthest, deepest, most ignorant edge of Europe, in territorial terms, obviously, but also in cultural terms. After all, this is, in cultural terms, a spin-off of a Byzantium which itself is in deep decline and is very much, by then, subordinate to Latin Europe. And yet, this tiny, peripheral, uncultured principality becomes one of the greatest empires in world history, and also its high culture becomes one of the great ornaments of the world's musical, literary, dance high culture as well. So, as I say, as empires go, a triumph. And all the more so given the obstacles. I mean, the basic point about this empire is that no other empire in history has ever been so far north, so far from the centres of world trade and culture, subjected to a climate of quite this difficulty. You know, one way of thinking about Russian history is to think that between the snow, which is there for half the year almost, the distances, it's as if every operation of government or indeed of private citizens is subject to an enormous value-added tax. Everything. It's like Clausewitz's idea of war, a dense medium. You know, that is something which is usually said on the first page of general histories of Russia and then forgotten, but actually right the way through Russian history. It is as if you have to add a 20% VAT onto everything that's done. Remoteness from the centres of world trade and culture, that has all sorts of implications. World trade, apart from anything else, tends to mean towns, tends to mean middle classes, tends to mean education. Russia is extremely short in all those elements of sort of deep power. For example, in 1763, I think Russia has about 16,000 state officials. Prussia has 15,000. Prussia is 1% of the size of Russia in Europe. The Prussian bureaucracy can draw cadres from a whole swathe of universities in Germany, many of which had existed for centuries. The first Russian university, Moscow, is founded in 1755. Russia is, therefore, logically, what we usually call an agrarian empire. It's obviously not an empire which is capable of taxing international trade and deriving most of its revenues from international trade, etc. Agrarian empires have to draw the surplus to sustain a grand, majestic imperial monarchy and court, armed forces, bureaucracy, etc. Agrarian empires sustain them largely by squeezing the peasantry. But the world's most famous and successful agrarian empires, almost all, had their core in densely populated, fertile river valleys. The Nile, an obvious example, the Yellow River, an obvious example, and lots more. The core territory, if you can talk of a core territory, of the Muscovite state and therefore of the Russian Empire, is this vast, infertile area in north-central, what we now call Russia. Remember that the Russian population is smaller than the French population until the 1760s. So you are attempting to squeeze a surplus out of an agrarian population scattered across this vast area with a very inadequate surplus simply because the land is so poor. Not at all surprisingly, Russian administration is not exactly famous for its efficiency. The wonder is that it functions at all. And then on top of that, you have to remember where Russia is in geopolitical terms. It is right on the edge of the world's greatest home of the nomad, in other words, the Eurasian steppe. And as I said, I think in my first, or was it my second lecture, for 1,500, 2,000 years, the nomads are, in military terms, superior to the sedentary cultures which are their neighbours. You know, if nomads on a number of occasions succeed in conquering China, the world's greatest and most populous civilization, it's hardly surprising that the little Russian principalities are extremely vulnerable to nomadic power. From the 16th century, as the balance of power between nomad and sedentary begins to swing towards sedentary societies, the Russians find themselves on another periphery, which is the periphery of Latin Europe, the world's increasingly most powerful and most expansionist region. So one of the great, or perhaps the greatest, challenges of Russian history is how you mobilize the resources from this peripheral, relatively poor area to keep the world's most expansionist region at bay. So far, this sounds like, and indeed to some extent is, a sob story told by nationalists full of self-pity. And Russian nationalists are not short of self-pity, you can be sure of that, but they do have a case. On the other hand, God did not completely deprive them of advantages. Those rivers which flow through central Russia, relatively flat, are absolutely crucial to integrating the territory. They're navigable, etc., etc., etc. Then you have something that I think all of you will realize, strategic depth. You know, it's a pompous way of putting the fact that if you're invading from Central Europe, you've got a long way to go across pretty inhospitable territory before you reach the Russian heartlands. And then on top of that, and less obviously known, is something I think I mentioned in both the previous lectures, but I will just mention once again because it is very important. You know, when the Mongol Empire collapses, this huge geopolitical vacuum opens up between European Russia and the Pacific Ocean. The Russians get across it in about 100 years against, in historical terms, minimal opposition. And out of this vacuum comes the center of the traditional arms and metallurgical industry in the Urals, come the furs, the gold, the silver, the horses, and the Cossacks, and a number of other goodies as well. And I made the comparison with the Ottomans, who inherited on their eastern border, when the Mongol Ilkhanate disappeared, not a geopolitical vacuum, but the extremely dangerous Shia Safavid rival in Iran. Okay, so that's just the introduction. So, in other words, if you are, on the basis of what I've just said, going to create and sustain an extremely effective great empire, you're going to have to be quite crafty. You're going to have to be quite good at empire building. And the Russians, indeed, in their own inimitable style, were very successful. These great Eurasian empires, I mean, they're all complicated, they're all different, but to a great extent, success boils down to the relationship between a powerful monarchy, some version of a landed aristocracy, and a religious authority. And by definition, the success of this triumvirate depends on their ability to exploit a large peasantry, but to exploit it with sufficient efficiency, if you want to put it that way, that they don't kill the goose. Okay, so we start with the monarchy. The thing about the Russian monarchy is that it is in principle, as we all know, an autocratic version of monarchy, absolute monarchy, divine right, on fundamentally the Byzantine model with some Mongol elements. The difference, I think, between the Russian monarchy and the Byzantine one, which are in formal terms legitimized by very similar Orthodox Christian doctrines, is that unlike the Byzantine imperial monarchy, Russia inherits none of the traditions of ancient Rome. One of the most interesting books, I think, on the Byzantine monarchy written recently is called The Byzantine Republic. And the point it's making, perhaps in a slightly exaggerated way, is that the crowd of Constantinople does still play a political role, certainly in the first centuries of the Byzantine imperial state. And so, by God, too, do the generals, the army. You cannot rely on the loyalty of the army. You have a large number of military coups. You have, to put things simply, very weak dynastic legitimacy. Slightly stronger than in ancient Rome, but far, far, far weaker than in Russia. Russia is the Byzantine Orthodox ideology of monarchy plus a very powerful dynastic tradition. And dynastic legitimacy is absolutely crucial to longevity in empires. Then again, you have what the political scientists call negative legitimation, which is a pompous way of reminding you of the time of troubles at the beginning of the 17th century. The old dynasty dies out, the Rurikids, civil war ensues between aristocratic claimants for the throne, the Poles invade, the Swedes invade, the Poles even try and put one of their princes on the throne in Moscow. There is a sort of proto-nationalist revolt. The Romanovs are elected as the new Tsarist dynasty, and from 1613, the election of Mikhail Romanov, the first Romanov emperor, Tsar, down to the revolution, one of the absolute pillars of Tsarist ideology, Tsarist legitimizing claims, is that the alternative to autocracy, the alternative to the absolute monarchy, the alternative to dynastic legitimacy is anarchy, the disintegration of Russia, and its conquest by foreign powers. And it's not entirely untrue. I mean, you know, when ideologues of the Russian monarchy and of the Russian state in the 18th century say that constitutionalism in Poland, constitutionalism in Sweden, and the sort of rather weird Ottoman version of 18th century constitutionalism have very much weakened Russia's three great traditional rivals on its western and southern frontier, they're actually right. So, you know, it's not the ideology of either us or chaos has some historical justification. And it is strengthened by the fact, and this is enormously important, that Russia is entirely surrounded by peoples of different religion. Whether you're talking about Latin Christians, Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, or the pagan peoples to the east. And therefore, you know, the sense of geopolitical threat is also a sense of civilizational threat and religious threat. And the claim that Russia is the only true Orthodox independent country, which of course is true by the 16th century, strengthens the link between the monarchy and the Orthodox community and Orthodox Church, of which it is the defender. So that takes me on to the second pillar, which is the Church. The Church and the monarchy are tightly connected. The decision of the Orthodox Patriarch to move to Moscow is vital for the rise of Moscow as the center of reintegrating Russian principalities as the Mongol control weakens and then collapses. And precisely after the fall of Byzantium, which is interpreted by most Russian Orthodox as God's punishment on the Byzantines for trying to do a deal with the Catholics and abandon true religion, Russia rejects that. Russia survives as the only Orthodox independent country, certainly the only independent great country. And this is, again, all part of this symbiotic relationship between monarchy and church and, if you like, Russian civilization. It was always the case, if you go back to Byzantium, that in comparison to the Roman Church, the Orthodox Church in the East was more linked to the monarchy, more dependent on the monarchy, than was true of the Roman Catholic Church, for the very obvious reason that when the Western Empire collapses, the Pope is basically left on his own. I'm not going to go into the whole history of papal church-state relations or church-monarchical relations in Eastern and Western Europe, but it is certainly true that the Byzantine, the Orthodox Church in general, is more dependent on the state than is the case with the Catholic Church. Very interesting in this respect is, you know, looking at what happens to the lands of the Christian churches in Europe. The basic point is that after the Reformation in Protestant countries, the enormous landholdings of the church
usually end up in the hands of one or other version of aristocracy. Woburn Abbey, the Dukes of Bedford, you know. How many English aristocrats, their great houses are called something Abbey? It's very true in Protestant Germany as well. In Catholic Europe, on the whole, at least until the 19th century, the church hangs on to its lands and is still a huge landowner. Only in Russia does the state expropriate the lands of the church but hang on to them for itself. That helps to explain that when serfdom is abolished in 1861, actually on the eve of abolition, just more than half of all Russian peasants are not serfs. They are state peasants or peasants of the imperial family. What that means is that the monarchy is not having to share the peasant, in inverted commas, surplus with the landowning aristocracy. It's keeping it all for itself. And that is a spin-off of its power, but also of its relationship with the religious authority, with the church. So then we get to the third and the most important pillar, probably, which I have spoken about before, and I will try and do so now briefly, which is the relationship between the monarchy and the landowning elite, the nobility. I said in an earlier lecture that given pre-modern communications, given the scale of empire, probably the single most fundamental factor in the longevity and success of an empire was the relationship between the central monarchical power and the landowning provincial elites. The monarchy has got to be strong enough not simply to become the tool of vested interests. It has got to retain its tax share of the peasant surplus. One of the most boring, but also actually quite insightful books about comparative imperial studies, Eisenstadt, goes on endlessly, Political Systems of Empires, about the need for the crown to defend its share of the peasant surplus, because you usually get a situation in which landowning aristocrats are trying to grab more and more and more, and the monarchy, 500, 1,000 miles away, has a hell of a struggle trying to keep them under control. The Russians do that. The relationship with the landowning gentry is stable. There is an agreed sharing out of the peasant surplus for all sorts of reasons. One Russian emperor, Paul I, calls the landowner the state's involuntary tax collector and recruitment agent for the army in the villages, and that's what he is. Well, given the size of Russia and given the small size of the bureaucracy, the landowning elites and their relationship with the crown is even more important than in the other great Eurasian empires. Basically, it's a deal from which both benefit. The Tsar cannot rule, let alone exploit, the land and the peasant population, except through the intermediary of the landowners. They recruit his armies, hand over the recruits. They, to a great extent, man the tax system. On the other hand, they themselves benefit, firstly, because they make careers and derive incomes from the service in the Tsar's army as officers, and in his bureaucracy to some extent. They also are protected against serf insurrection. It's a sort of wonderful symbiotic relationship, unless you're a peasant, when it's not quite so wonderful. What Peter the Great does is not challenge this relationship, but on the contrary, modernize it. In Russia in the 17th century, just like in Western and Central Europe in the 17th century, just like in the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century, your traditional cavalryman, knight in armour, if you want to call it, or the Ottoman and Russian variations on that theme, is becoming militarily redundant. What happens in most of Latin Europe, and what happens in Russia, is that the knight becomes an officer in the monarch's army. And that cements the relationship. The knight also becomes the local administrator, the JP in England, the Justice of the Peace, or the grander aristocrat is the Lord Lieutenant. You have variations on this theme across Europe and very much in Russia. As I said in my previous lecture, that relationship collapses in the Ottoman Empire, which is in many ways the key to Ottoman geopolitical decline. What Peter does is to drive that transformation so that the noble cavalryman becomes an effective professional army, wearing the Tsar's uniform, with the Tsar's insignia on his epaulettes, with the gorget, both in symbolic terms and in real power political terms. This is a deeply rooted alliance. And it's deeply rooted in the fact that it works. This relatively small country then goes on to conquer a vast swathe of much more fertile agrarian land, most of which is then divided up among the gentry and aristocracy. The system works. It rewards those who, put their stake in the system. If you're going to make international comparisons, the Russian setup is certainly closer to the European one when you're talking about the ruling class and its relationship with the monarchy than it is to what goes on in China or in the Islamic world or anywhere else, actually, that I can think of. Very obviously, the Russian warrior, landowning, hereditary elite is not at all like Confucian bureaucrats in China. It is not at all like the slaves of the Ottoman Sultan, who are the core of the Ottoman system of rule at the pinnacle of the Ottoman Empire. It has something more in common with Mughal elites in India, or indeed with Qing Manchu elites in China. But the Russian landowning nobility, warrior landing nobility, is native. It's far older, it's far more rooted in its native society than is the case with this imported Mughal nobility, or of course with the Manchus, who are a conquest people in China. Even in structural terms, let alone, of course, when you talk about the cultural westernization of the elites, it's closer to Europe. What, of course, is true is that the Russian nobility and the Russian, if you want to call it constitutional setup, constitutional in inverted commas, is not Western feudalism. There is no contract, there are no representative institutions, etc., 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 until they're imported from the West by Catherine in the 18th century. Traditionally, because everything was seen through a European prism and in comparison to Europe, there was the concentration of attention was on the fact that the Russian nobility, in this sense, was not European. It was, in a sense, it failed to be European. It did not provide the basis for constitutional and then constitutional liberal and then liberal democratic development, as to some extent feudal institutions in Central and Western Europe did. You've got to be careful about this. Basically, it's silly to call the Russians or accuse the Russians of failing to do something which they were never trying to achieve. Before the 18th century, the Russian state, the Russian elites did not model themselves on feudal Europe. They operated according to a different logic. And within their own terms, that logic made great success. Look, if you'd stuck in the infertile heartlands of the Muscovite state, you'd set up constitutional institutions to limit the monarchy, very soon you would have been penniless. Instead, by, in a sense, creating this tight alliance between the elites and the monarchy, which then goes on to conquer everything in the neighbourhood and share out the goodies among the shareholders, the stakeholders, you do yourself a good term, and the system works very well in the terms it sets itself. So I say, it makes sense to think of the Russians in the much broader comparative round, rather than obsessing about European viewpoints which distort the reality and are imposed on Russia from what seems to me a false perspective. All right, so we have this really rather successful, very successful if you like, early modern imperial setup. And then the great issue becomes, as modernity impinges by the mid-19th century, with the arrival of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, with the impact of the ideas of the Enlightenment and then of the French Revolution, how are you going to turn this really very successful pre-modern or early modern imperial system into a viable modern polity? And that is quite a challenge. And before you go overboard sort of thinking that the rulers of Imperial Russia messed everything up, to some extent they did, you do have to put that challenge into some kind of comparative perspective. One way of doing that is to think that, after all, yes, indeed, Russia in 1914 is a great empire, one of the 5 or 6 great empires which dominate the earth. No one of those great empires has survived the challenge of the 20th century, the challenge of modern nationalism, the challenge, in a way, of 2 world wars, which destroyed many empires, but also the fundamental challenge that it is much more difficult to run an empire when you're dealing with modern human beings, educated, urbanized, with the expectations which have been bred up through the era of the French Revolution, liberalism, democracy, etc. than, of course, it is to sustain an empire in pre-modern times when you're fundamentally ruling over peasants, and the dominant intellectual climate thinks of hierarchy and divine appointment as being natural and legitimate. The second way of putting things into comparative context is a little bit more complicated, but I rather like it. For me, this particular context began with my fascination with Spain and comparisons between Spain and Russia. Then I got on to Ireland and comparisons between Ireland and Russia. Then, with two of my colleagues at LSE, I taught a course which was called The Second Europe, which was basically looking at the European periphery, west, south, and east, from the time when modernity begins to impinge, sort of mid-19th century, down to 1945. And that included Ireland, Spain and Portugal, Italy, the Balkans, and the Russian Empire, basically. Now, this is a hugely diverse region. It isn't a region, it's a periphery, not one region. Obviously, if you're comparing, Italy to Russia and Ireland to Greece, But there are nevertheless some quite important commonalities, certainly when compared with what I think of as the first world, the European core. In the first place, on the periphery, not just is society and economy poorer, but you have huge peasantries usually in the mid-19th century and well into the 20th century, much smaller middle classes. Property, particularly in the countryside, is less secure. The state itself is weaker. It may look stronger, but its actual power of penetration into society is much weaker than in Britain or France or Germany. Provinces are usually less integrated into one, if you want to call it that, national whole. I mean, one way of thinking of this, I think one of the best books I read on, certainly 19th century France, but in many ways 19th century Europe, it's actually about the second half of the 19th century, it's called Peasants into Frenchmen, by Weber, not the Weber you think about. What he is basically arguing is that the French state in the second half of the 19th century, particularly under the Third Republic, through its educational system, through its system of mass conscription, through the prestige of French high culture, and not just the state, but also civil society, the newspapers, you name it, create what you could describe as a nation. They turn Breton-speaking peasants, peasants from Aquitaine, peasants from all over the place, into French citizens, with some strong conception of being French citizens. The Italian state fails to do that, even as regards the urban population of the south, let alone the Italian peasantry. They fail to turn them into Italians, at least as Italians are defined by the royal Italian state and elite. But Italy is actually at the top of the Second World ladder. Further down are Spain and Russia, if you're looking at per capita income in 1914. If you're comparing Spain to France, the French do succeed to a great extent in turning Breton into Frenchmen. There are newspapers in France, though, by 1900, which have circulations of over 1 million people. The largest national newspaper in Spain has a circulation of what? I think it's 25,000 at the time. And if you're looking at the comparison between Russia and Italy, yes, indeed, the Italian educational system fails to turn the urban population of the south and the peasantry into royal Italian citizens. But there are 2.2 teachers per thousand in Italy and 1.2 in Russia. So again, Russia is at the bottom. So you do have a real problem as these countries of the periphery attempt to come to terms with modernity. And it is to the point that in these countries you very often have political extremes of every sort. It is to the point that virtually no country of what we call the Second World, the European periphery, had a peaceful transition to liberal democracy, or indeed even liberal capitalism, in the 20th century. Between the two world wars, virtually all these countries were ruled by authoritarian regimes of the right or of the left. So that is the broader sort of European and even to some extent global comparison, looking slightly more precisely at Russia. I could go on about this for a very long time. I've written quite a few books on the subject, but if you were going to very crudely sum up the dilemma which faces the last Russian emperor, and indeed his father and grandfather to an only slightly lesser extent, it really boils down to this. In his left ear, Nicholas II is told by his more liberal, of course, liberal in relative Tsarist terms, advisors, roughly speaking, the following. Look, Your Majesty, almost 20% of your subjects are modern Europeans, educated, literate, you name it. Now, 20% may not sound that much, but 20% of 170 million people is the size of a very large urban middle-class civil society anywhere else in Europe. These people take for granted their right to have the same civil and indeed political rights as their European peers. They think this is their birthright. This is what modernity requires, demands, owes to them. This is a sophisticated society, Your Majesty. You're already dealing, actually even here, with some newspapers with circulations in the hundreds of thousands. You're dealing with, modern capitalist institutions, insurance companies, you name it. You're also dealing with the world of Stravinsky, Chagall, the whole lot. This, in some ways, is a highly sophisticated modern European society, which is almost postmodern before it's securely bourgeois. Do you really think that you can go on ruling this society on the basis of 18th century ideas about enlightened despotism mixed in with medieval ideas about divine right monarchy? No, you cannot. And if you attempt to do so, our regime, your regime, will lose all legitimacy and it will collapse. And these people were right. It seemed utterly absurd to many educated Russians that Nicholas II should be attempting to rule on the basis of divine right monarchy ideologies for which Charles I had lost his head in 1649. And that was about as far as an awful lot of the Western historiography of late Tsarist Russia got when I first arrived on the scene. And if only that had been the whole story, life would have been very simple. The trouble was that in his other ear, Nicholas II had his more conservative advisors. And what they said to him was, yes, that's fine, Your Majesty. It may be that 20, actually it's only 18%, but still, of your population could be described as European. But actually, take 20 from 100 and you're left with 80%. The overwhelming majority of your subjects are not modern Europeans. In fact, they're barely Europeans of any sort. They don't share the assumptions about private property, etc., 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 that even the French or German peasantry have. We face the possibility, and indeed the reality in 1905, of agrarian revolution. Although the aristocracy and gentry in Russia own a far smaller percentage of the land than is true in Prussia, Germany, the Prussian kingdom, or indeed, of course, above all in Britain. Nevertheless, they do still own a considerable amount, and they are likely targets of an agrarian revolution designed to actually get rid of them. Then you have to face the fact that we have the most radical working class in Europe, which the conservatives above all blamed on the fact that the working class inherited the collectivist traditions of the peasantry. But also, of course, perfectly fairly enough in a way, pointed to both the poverty, the exploitation and the gross inequalities and the lack of legitimacy of early capitalism in Russia for all the obvious reasons, plus the fact that such a large percentage of early capitalist wealth is non-Russian. Maybe Armenian, Jewish, German, foreign, you name it, but it's very, very often not Russian. Then they point to the fact that Russia already since the 1860s has a revolutionary movement committed to the destruction not just of the monarchy, but of private property and all the other institutions of European society. A revolutionary movement with which there can be no compromise, because these people are committed to the total destruction of the society which the Tsarist state defends, the European society in Russia. And then finally, they mention the point that only 44% of the Tsar's subjects are Russians anyway. So they say, look, if you liberalize, let alone democratize, you are going to destroy both the empire and the foundations of what they did not call but meant by bourgeois society in Russia. And they say, at least until we have turned the Russian peasantry into something looking like the French or German peasantry, and created a solid group of conservative, small to medium farmers in the countryside. Any serious democratization is going to lead to revolution. And the problem is they also had a point, and Nicholas is stuck in the middle. And that leaves him with a very narrow and winding path, and in a position where solutions to some problems exacerbate others. That doesn't necessarily mean that the regime is going to collapse in 1914. There was no sign it was about to collapse, though it very nearly had done in the 1905 revolution, less than a decade before. I think it's probably true that without the First World War, you wouldn't have had a revolution, certainly not for a few more years. I mean, God knows, these counterfactuals are almost impossible. But on the other hand, the First World War was not just an accident which came from nowhere. I mean, fundamentally, Russia before 1914, like Russia before 1939, faces the same problem. Given German power, given German propensity to expansion, given the fact that Germany's rulers correctly believe that whereas they now are Europe's potential hegemon, within a generation Russia will be unstoppable, we really have two options. Either we gang up with the other flanking powers, which means the French and the British, to try to deter Germany, or if that fails, to defeat her in war, or we try to do a deal with the Germans, basically try to encourage them to compete with the English and the French over domination of Western Europe and the oceans, stay neutral and have a generation, at least, in which we can develop our own enormous potential resources, mitigate some of our domestic political crises, etc., etc. Those are the two options. Either we deter or we try and divert, deflect. Russian policy before 1914, in the end, opts for deterrence. The alliance with the French and British, which fails. Germany is not deterred, and the attempt to defeat it in war destroys Imperial Russia. Maybe Germany would have been deterred if the British commitment to deterrence had been unequivocal and realistic. But that would have required conscription, a defensive military alliance with the French, and a unilateral commitment to Belgian neutrality, and that was simply impossible in the Britain pre-1914. So deterrence fails at enormous cost to the Russians. It's war, it's revolution, it's civil war, it's two famines, it's the Bolshevik dictatorship, it's terror, and then it's the Second World War as well. Some of Nicholas II's advisors, particularly some of his more conservative advisors, urged on him a strategy of deflection. Keep the traditional alliance with Germany, persuade the Germans that their future is on the oceans and outside Europe, encourage them to see Britain as their main competitor. The British and French on the one hand and the Germans on the other will neutralize each other. We will be able to get on with our own business. And what these people, including my great hero Pyotr Donavo, where my entire academic career began, who wrote a famous memorandum for Nicholas II in February 1914, telling him that if he went to war, there'd be a total social revolution in Russia. They urged this policy on Nicholas II, and for reasons which are perfectly understandable, he doesn't accept it. Stalin does in 1939. Essentially what Donavo and co. urged on Nicholas, Stalin does with the non-aggression pact with Germany. The calculation there is precisely that the British, French and Germans will face each other off for a generation. The Soviet Union in that generation will become overwhelmingly the most powerful country in northern Eurasia. And that ends in disaster too. So, the point to make is not that either Nicholas or Stalin were idiots. It was that this was a very, very difficult calculation to make. And indeed, it was a calculation in which there were so many imponderables and contingencies that you could never be sure that you'd made the right decision, because so much would depend on the actions of others and on chance. All right, so we're in the First World War. That, obviously should be a pretty good reason, just what I've said so far, for stressing the importance of war, geopolitics, etc. in Russian history. And you might think that that was almost self-evident. Well, I think it is, but never underestimate the ability of academic fashion to push the self-evident to the side. When I joined the profession, it was really very hard to talk about war, diplomacy, foreign policy, geopolitics, you name it. They were hugely unfashionable. That is because among Russianists in that era, the whole study of Russian history was geared to the Cold War context. It was an ideological conflict, and arguing about foreign policy and the Germans was irrelevant to the struggle between the Soviet Union and the West over imperialism, etc. In any event, in my generation, academic fashion was history from below, social history. So studying foreign policy, international history, war was off the agenda. Beyond that, and particularly, of course, with the Americans in my generation, attitudes were very much influenced by Vietnam, dislike of what was seen as cold warriors, and, very much, therefore, encouraged the whole attitude of social history being the key, history from below, democratic history, you name it. Now, one of the things that always struck me with the sort of irony was that a lot of these people admired Lenin. Well, there are reasons for admiring Lenin, there are reasons for hating him, that's a different matter. But the one thing you can say about Lenin was that he understood power, and he was a realist in many ways. And Lenin was deeply concerned with the international context, globalization, geopolitics, you name it. Deeply concerned with one of the factors that was usually left out of the story when it was told by historians of my generation in the West. That is foreign intervention. Not the pathetic foreign intervention you know about, which is the foreign intervention after the war of the Western Allies, but the potential for German intervention before and actually during the war. Let me give you a sort of counterfactual but also a comparison. In the winter of 1905-6, the Tsarist regime very, very nearly collapsed. Its survival hung by a thread. If it had collapsed, the revolution would have gone far to the left. Perhaps not as far as in 1917, but far to the left. It is simply unimaginable that in peacetime the European great powers would have stood aside while Russia seceded from the international system, set itself up as the headquarters of international socialist revolution, and repudiated the equivalent of trillions of dollars in contemporary terms of foreign debt. In the lead, as regards foreign intervention, would have been Imperial Germany, Russia's neighbour with the most formidable army in Europe, but also, over and above the other three reasons already cited for intervening, the Germans would have had to go in to rescue the German communities in Russia from revolution, particularly the Baltic Germans. In the winter of 1905, William II promises the representatives of the Baltic Germans in Berlin that he will not intervene so long as the Russian monarchy survives, but if it falls, the German army will come in to rescue them. And although that would not have been easy, and William's promises are not German policy, it seems to me inconceivable that Imperial Germany could have stood by and watched the expropriation and in many cases the murder of the Baltic German elites in particular. I think that intervention in peacetime would certainly have succeeded in the short to medium term anyway. Now roll on to 1917. Germany, which would have spearheaded international counter-revolution in peacetime, now pushes the revolution as far as it can to the left. Lenin gets back to Russia in the famous seal train, care of the German General Staff. Because of the First World War, for one whole year after seizing power, the Bolshevik regime is left in peace by the European great powers. It is given a year's breathing space by the fact the war is going on to establish its institutions and its control over the geopolitical, demographic, military and industrial core of Russia, of the old Russian Empire. And it is its control over that core which is the key to its victory in the Civil War. So you've got a study of Russia in the West which is obsessed by the revolution. Everything is about the revolution. And yet it won't look at this issue of foreign intervention because in a sense that spoils the bun fight between left and right within the Western intelligentsia, which itself is a spin-off of the Cold War. There is, though, another very interesting counterfactual. And that revolves partly around Ukraine. If, in my opinion, any counterfactual always starts with, in my opinion, It seems to me very probable that if the Germans had not brought the United States into the First World War, on the very eve of the Russian Revolution beginning to take Russia out, the Germans would probably have won the First World War on points. There is no way on earth that the Western Allies were going to defeat Germany without the United States and without Russia. 1917, when 1917 arrives, the British are looking increasingly desperate because it looks as if they're not going to be able to go on financing the war without the continuation of American financial support, and American financial support is becoming more and more dubious. This is also the year, not just of the Russian Revolution, but of the near elimination of Italy after the defeat at Caporetto and the mutinies in the French army. Not in a trillion years are the Western Allies going to be able to defeat Germany on their own. What is within Germany's grasp is not complete victory, but to win the First World War on points, you don't need complete victory. You don't need to win on the Western Front. All you need is stalemate on the Western Front and victory in the East. Victory embodied in the peace treaty between Germany and Russia at Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. What Brest-Litovsk establishes is German hegemony in Central and Eastern Europe by the disintegration of the Russian Empire, and above all else, what it achieves is the nominal independence of Ukraine, but as de facto a German protectorate. The point is that no Ukraine can exist notionally independent except as a German protectorate, because only the Germans can protect it against its Russian and Polish external enemies, and because internally any independent Ukrainian state in those days faces the opposition of Russians, Jews, and socialists. And it rests on the very insecure foundations of a peasant majority which does not yet feel itself Ukrainian. This is not to deny the validity of Ukrainian independence in the longer run. Given time, a Ukrainian state would have inculcated a sense of Ukrainian identity in the peasantry through its educational system, but it needed 2 generations, and only German protection could provide that. Would that have been better than what actually happened? Who knows? There are moments when I think the world would be a better place if the Germans had won the First World War on points. It's a moot point. You know, the notionally independent Ukrainian state under German protection was certainly a more viable potential nation state than the Iraq, which the British set up as their protectorate in 1918-19 in order to control Mesopotamian oil. When I say, would it have been better, you know, the idea that handing East Central Europe over to the tender mercies of Erich Ludendorff and his buddies is not a happy solution. But it may be better than a Second World War, Hitler, Stalin, and the Holocaust. And the whole point about the way the First World War ended is that it made a Second World War probable. Not certain, but probable. The basic irony about the First World War is this is a war which begins as a battle between Russia and the 2 Germanic empires for the domination of East Central Europe and ends with the defeat of all 3. The Versailles settlement is made against Germany and Russia and without Germany and Russia. Germany and Russia are the 2 latently most powerful communities in Europe. You cannot have a European lasting settlement against Germany and against Russia. If Russia had been one of the victors, if the Franco-Russian alliance had survived, you could not have had Hitler. If Germany had been one of the victor, then you might have had a new European order rooted in German hegemony east of the Rhine. You, in fact, fell down the middle. All right, so we're now on into, you know, the 20th century. I am not a historian of the Soviet Union. And although I taught Soviet politics at LSE for all sorts of accidental reasons, I would not normally be standing in front of you about to say something about Soviet politics or Soviet history. But by a series of accidents, and when I give my little more autobiographical talk on Tuesday, I'll say something about this. I was both on a senior intelligence security committee in the last years of the Cold War, and above all on Margaret Thatcher's Foreign Policy Advisory Committee, and I did a vast amount of talking on radio and television and writing in the press. In an attempt to try and put the era of perestroika in the broader context of Russian history, to explain what was going on and give some hints as to what might happen to Thatcher, to ministers, to the broader public, even to the intelligence people, I came up with a concept of modern history, modern Russian history, which roughly goes as follows. I saw modern Russian history as being three great cycles of modernization, all of them initiated from above by the state, all of them designed above all else to ensure that Russia became and remained a European and then world great power. The first of these great cycles begins in the 17th century and really ends in the mid-19th century with Russia's defeat in the Crimean War. Its greatest hero is Peter I, Peter the Great, but the sign that Russia has succeeded, that it has become one of the unequivocally great European powers, is Alexander I's entry into Paris in 1814. Then along comes the Industrial Revolution, and in the Crimean War it becomes clear that Russia is fighting, communicating with pre-industrial, pre-modern technologies, and its English and French allies are moving and fighting with modern ones. And unless Russia transforms itself to become a great power in the era of the Industrial Revolution, then it is going to go the way of the Qing, the Safavids, the Mughals, and the Ottomans. And in that era, the era of high imperialism, the choice is largely between either being one of the gobblers or one of the gobbled, to put things in academic terms. So you then have the start of the second great cycle of modernization, launched by Alexander II, who comes to the throne in 1855, the era of great reforms, abolition of serfdom, European legal system, elected local self-governments, etc., a whole range of reforms. And to my mind, that second great cycle of modernization, which is trying to promote Russia and then sustain Russia as a great power in the industrial era, begins in the mid-19th century and ends in the 1870s. And its great sign of success is Stalin's arrival in Berlin in 1945. The Soviet Union then becomes not just a great industrial power, but a great industrial superpower. And then in the 1970s, it begins to be clear that we are moving into a different era. The world capitalist economy is moving on to a different, in a sense, post-industrial level. And the dilemma before the rulers of the Soviet Union is how to transform their country so that it remains a great power into the 21st century. Not just, I wouldn't push it, just in these hard power terms, though I think they're what is most important. It is also a question, though this overlaps, of creating a society in which Russian and then Soviet elites can themselves take pride, feel that they are part of a leading world power, feel that they have, they belong to a community which is in the forefront of history. And that is very true of Alexander's elites as well. Pretty clearly, the best comparison, the best parallel between perestroika, Gorbachev and co. and the previous cycles is with the second cycle, Alexander's great reforms in the 1850s, 60s and 70s. This is liberal modernization. It is modernization, cycle of modernization in the mid-19th century, high point of Victorian liberalism, and in the 1980s with Reagan and Thatcher on the move, and even the Chinese communists beginning to take on board elements of liberal capitalism. Even the terminology is similar. Words like perestroika, glasnost, the whole lot, zakonnost, legality. These are directly borrowed from the terminology of Alexander II's great reforms. And the principles are in many ways the same. The point about liberty, freedom, is that this is not just seen as a good in itself, but is seen as the key to power. Liberalizing, freeing up the economic initiative of the population in order to create wealth, whether that means breaking up serfdom or breaking up the command economy, creating a legal order which will protect private initiative, private property, opening up to the outside world so new ideas come into Russia and can circulate, weakening the censorship, transforming the educational system, etc., 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 etc. Also, to some extent, mobilizing support from reformist circles in Russian society in order to undermine the vested interests which will oppose what the state's rulers see as absolutely necessary reform. All absolutely splendid, but it was totally clear to little Lieven sitting in London that the pitfalls and the dangers and the disasters which had befallen Alexander II's regime were going to be an enormous challenge, an even bigger challenge to Gorbachev as well. The reason I wrote so much, got involved so much, was partly because it struck me that in comparison to most of my Sovietological colleagues, a historian of Imperial Russia was well placed, better placed in many ways, to understand what was going on. And the point was simple. What Gorbachev had done, naively, overnight, without really pondering the implications, was bringing back onto the Soviet agenda probably the greatest issue in late Tsarist politics. In other words, how do you introduce into the authoritarian Russian political tradition, or Soviet, the Russian political tradition, Russian political culture, Russian political institutions, all sorts of ideas and institutions drawn from the liberal West? How do you marry the two without undermining the system? The Tsarist regime had agonized over this for generations. It had sometimes succeeded, sometimes not. And in some ways, its failure to marry these traditions led to the revolution. Suddenly, overnight, the Soviet regime is doing this as if there was no yesterday. And I think the fact that the Soviet regime, Soviet ideology, the Soviet elites had absolutely, for ideological reasons, cut themselves off from any intelligent understanding of the Russian past, did contribute enormously to their inability to understand the pit they were digging underneath their own feet. Perfectly clearly, look, 7 years after the death of Nicholas I and the demise of what was in many ways the most conservative regime in Europe, you've got small but nevertheless significant elements in Russian society beginning to call for the overthrow not just of the monarchy, but of private property and marriage. And this is mid-Victorian Europe. 7 years after Alexander begins to liberalize, you have full-scale revolution in Poland, suppressed by hundreds of thousands of Russian troops. When you take the brakes off, these systems are fragile. Systems rooted in inertia and fear are fragile when you begin to liberalize, particularly when you have an already a whole arsenal of frustration built up in educated society because of the previous repression. Now, if all of this was true under Alexander, it was bound to be truer, much truer, under Gorbachev. In the first place, the Soviet regime was new. It was founded within living memory. It had an enormous number of skeletons shallowly buried. Publicity? Well, Solzhenitsyn's comment, tell the truth about the past and your regime will collapse. There's some truth in that. If you talked about zakonnost, legality, well, the Soviet constitutional law gave republics the right to secede. So you're going to be in trouble there. More fundamentally, much more fundamentally, in the 1860s, there was no democratic polity on earth. The one which came closest to the United States was in the middle of a civil war. By 1980s, democracy is the only game in town when it comes to legitimacy. In the 1860s, empire is entirely legitimate. The most progressive countries in the world have great empires. So they think, anyway. They think they're the most progressive, and most other people agree. By 1980s, empire is completely illegitimate. And it's not just that. Gorbachev and the Soviet regime is not just sitting on the territorial inheritance of the Russian Empire. It's got a vast informal empire across the whole of Central and Eastern Europe, and one which is increasingly illegitimate because very few East Central Europeans believe in Marxism-Leninism any longer, and Willy Brandt has undercut fear of Germany, which was the other pillar of Soviet empire in Eastern Europe. So it was absolutely likely that Gorbachev was going to get himself into the most terrible tangle. And I must say, I remember just watching with utter astonishment from London at the naivety of a leadership which could open a Pandora's box on this scale and seem to be unaware of exactly what they were doing. So here I come to my end. I'm very nearly finished. In about 2010, a Swedish think tank for which I'd written the odd piece back in the perestroika era, and even, I think, 93, 94, asked me to come back and review things I'd read and asked me whether they thought my 3 cycles of modernization, my basic paradigm for understanding Russian history, when I was looking at things and trying to explain things in the Gorbachev era, still applied? And my basic answer was almost certainly no. It wasn't that they were irrelevant, but this is not the way I would try and explain the contemporary challenges facing Russia or what might happen in the future. And that was basically for 3 reasons. I mean, I could come up with 103, but 3, I think, really matter. The first is simply climate change. You know, everything that we have, I mean, our entire perception of where we stand in history is to a considerable extent owed to the perception, the correct perception, that we have overcome the Malthusian trap. Now, let us hope that we will succeed in mitigating climate change and that various technologies, whether it's geoengineering or whatever, will result in most of mankind being able, you know, to carry on with the growth of wealth, prosperity, you know, a whole lot. But even if we do mitigate, even where we are now, let alone where we're likely to be in 20 years' time, it's pretty obvious that climate change is going to create an enormous number of political struggles, crises, etc., which are going to make the international system very different to what it was, you know, in the period that I was talking about, the 300 years before Gorbachev. The second point, and I think, you know, also very relevant, well, you'd have noticed that my 3 cycles of modernization are all linked to the idea and the fact that the most progressive and the most powerful states in the world are the European Western polities. They are Russia's model. They have to be, because they're what you've got to match in order to survive. But they're also the countries from which you draw your models and your inspiration for progress, etc., etc., etc. So we get the second big question. We've not just got the Malthusian trap, but we've got the probability, I suspect, that the era of unequivocal Western predominance is gone. God only knows where China and India and Indonesia will be headed in the next 40 years. But it would surprise me enormously if, to a considerable extent, we had not reverted to a pre-modern pattern in which the Latin world was very much not superior, put it this way, to the Islamic world or China. In fact, we were number 3 on the list. I'm not saying that we'll be number 3, but I would expect a far greater degree of parity in the world in terms of relative power, if that is, and this will be my last lecture, if that is, we survive the crisis which is bound to come when 300 years of Western predominance in the world have to give way to the rise of China, the rise of India, you name it. I mean, that is not going to be an easy transition to manage. So that's the second point. The third, and the much narrower one, but what I'll talk about in my next lecture, is it seems to me that the most basic problem facing Russia now in many ways is after empire. The crisis which usually does come when a great empire collapses. I'll talk about this in my next lecture, but in one way it can be put pretty simply. I mean, it can't actually. It needs to be put in complicated, but there is one point which people don't always grasp, which does in some ways go to the core of the present problem, whether you're talking about Ukraine or more broadly about Russia's position in the world. Look, when the great West European transoceanic empires collapsed, Britain, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal were in practice demoted from great power status. It may have taken a generation, it may have taken even 2, but they were demoted. These are now very definitely countries of third-class status in the world system. The point about Russia is that because it was a land empire and because it has retained the jewel in the imperial crown, which is Siberia, it is actually a second-class power. It isn't a superpower, it is only equivocally a truly great power. But it is not more or less insignificant as the West European metropoles of the former transoceanic empires are. And it isn't actually easy to cope with a second-class power, a semi-empire, nor is it necessarily easy to know how to behave as a second-class empire. Does that mean that I'm saying everything is a question of power? No. Look, if Britain, like Russia, was attached by land and was the same one united polity, as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, even God knows South Africa, it would be a much more powerful international actor than the present United Kingdom is. It would be, if you like, a second-class power. Would it behave like Russia? Probably not. Culture matters. But power is also something we can never forget. If all we had to worry about was a lot of freaks in Russia squeaking about imperial heritage and dressing up in Napoleonic uniforms, you know, we could sort of wave them away. They'd be sort of freaks, but they would be sort of relatively harmless. It's the power, the fact that this is still a second-class power, that makes them frightening and dangerous. Good, that's all I'll say. Thank you, but I think we've got time for questions. Yeah.